Hello and welcome to this very informal episode of Unbelievable. I'm amongst friends, very distinguished colleagues, and we're going to have a chat about science, religion, and reality. Before we get into the content, why don't you just introduce yourself and say who you are?
Yes, I'm Zachary Ardern. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at an institute in Cambridge. My research is on evolutionary genomics. I'm interested in how evolution works, mostly in bacteria, but also working in viruses. So I work on the mechanisms of evolution and also thinking about some bigger picture questions in evolutionary theory. My background, though, at undergrad was both philosophy and biology, so I'm also interested in some of the bigger questions of life and faith in science and the nature of reality. So I look forward to the conversation today.
Excellent. Alex?
And I'm Dr. Alex Carter. I am a teaching professor at the University of Cambridge. I have historically focused on the philosophy of religion, but now tend to focus much more on questions like AI and creativity. I can't think why. But very eager to talk about discussions in religion. In particular, very interested in the philosophy of religion of Ludwig Wittgenstein, a philosopher of the 20th century, and a contemporary of his, Simone Weil, who is a beautiful theologian and a very interesting thinker. So I suspect those voices might come up, but I want to really focus on this question of realities because that's a great topic to pick.
Yeah, just a small topic. And I'm Sam McKee. I'm Associate Tutor in History and Philosophy of Science at Manchester Metropolitan University and a DNA repair researcher at the University of Reading. And so I love how these, when the humanities and the sciences clash or
Come together,
or that's what we're going to get into. So, gentlemen, it's 100 years ago this year that two quite significant and very different events in science and religion happened. It was the Scopes monkey trial, where a Tennessee schoolteacher, John Scopes, was put on trial for the crime of teaching evolution to his students, and became one of the biggest trials in the 20th century, where you have Christians outside the courtroom waving crosses, singing "Give me that old-time religion," and decrying the evils of evolution. But on the other side of the Atlantic, at Cambridge, you have this really extraordinary Cambridge University symposium called Science, Religion and Reality, with distinguished guests, including a scientist, philosopher, and former Prime Minister, Lord Balfour, and Joseph Needham, Sir Arthur Eddington, all these academics with different beliefs coming together to have a better conversation about science, religion, and reality, both happening at the same time. One very much viewing science and religion as in conflict, and another is seeing a much richer dialogue happening. So today we're going to try and have a better conversation about science, religion, and reality. But first of all, I'll start with you, Alex. We've got Ian Barber's 4 models of how science and religion relate to each other. The conflict model, made most famous, I suppose, recently by Richard Dawkins. The separation model, non-overlapping magisteria, most famously popularized by Stephen Jay Gould. The integration model, and a dialogue model. Which do you like?
I mean, any question like pick a model is typically going to be presented to a philosopher and they'll say, oh, well, they all are right. I mean, on the creativity point, just very briefly, almost every book on creativity will open with something like, there is no one definition of creativity, but the one I prefer is. So I guess the one I prefer is dialogue, but they all reflect some aspect of truth. I'm not against definitions. All these definitions are very illuminating, and we can get into what they add to our understanding of the relationship between the two. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive either. I think that if someone's suggesting there's a conflict between these different models, they're probably wrong as well. So even there's a dialogue. So how can there be a conflict between these two things for a start, since they have a shared history? Theology became natural philosophy became the sciences. We kept philosophy, we kept theology. But the question is, how do these things now relate to each other? Well, they relate to each other in the sense that they've separated, perhaps. So there might be this kind of separation model that we want to talk about there. Because in order to exist, it has to have left behind its previous model. But I don't believe in that kind of paradigmatic shifting of things. I think we can harken back to ancient ideas and bring forward new ideas. My worry is that we've lost an ability to dialogue with the past in interesting ways, that we've lost a deeper understanding of what religion was really getting at, what its reality was. And actually, in some ways, if we were to treat them as separate, if we were to focus on what religion does separate to science, and this is where perhaps we might get some disagreement going on here, I personally think we would find much more value in religion rather than losing what is of value. So I guess I'm in favor of all of them in different ways: separation because there's value to both, and dialogue because they both obviously impact each other. There's no question that science and religion impact each other, and they have a shared history, etc. One I would probably leave behind is the conflict.
Right.
I just don't think that's helpful to anyone, and it typically shows a misunderstanding between parties.
Right. There's lots we can pull out there, but I want to get Zach's answer to that as well. If you don't have to pick one model, but what's your favorite? What do you think is the best?
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to see science within the broader framework, at least for me, of my Christian faith. And I think historically that has been the way that scientists have tended to think about it. That many of the, at least in the West, the early modern scientists were often Christian, or at least very influenced by Christian ideas. And so for them, they saw them not as kind of separate worlds or as kind of two different kind of spheres that don't interact, but as science as kind of embedded within the broader framework of Christian faith. There have been points of conflict where theologians have said things that are scientifically false, and the scientific community has pushed back against that. And there's been points of harmony where many in the scientific community thought that there was a particular point of harmony coming from the science. And there's been much disinterest or apathy between the two communities. Also, the communities historically were often the same people, that the same people were both theologians and scientists. So someone like the polymath William Whewell, master of Trinity College, was very influential on Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin actually cites Whewell right at the very start of his on the Origin of Species, actually in a kind of theological context, trying to give a potential theological framing for the origin. And this kind of thing was the norm at that point and previously, but obviously in recent decades, the last century or so, this has shifted. It'll be interesting to kind of think through why that is and what went wrong or what went right in that history.
We'll draw some of that out, because I'd love to ask both of you about some of the things you just said. But coming to you, because you're a Wittgensteinian,
Wittgensteinian, if you want to be didactic about it.
Are science and religion speaking different languages?
Definitely not, because like I said, there is dialogue and there is conflict, in the sense that a discovery within science can change religion, but not typically directly. It doesn't directly rule it out. So for instance, the analogy I make is between the introduction of showers means that we have fewer baths, but showers don't contradict baths. It's just typically that you don't do both. So the idea that we would look for the cause of things might prevent you from, for instance, experiencing the miracle of things. So again, the reverence or awe that you might experience in a moment will be dampened just because, we look for the cause of things, and that's how we do things. But I think there are trite ways in which people try to build this through language. So they'll say things like, I can explain why people have religious beliefs in psychological terms, to which I respond, I can explain why people do psychology in psychological terms. Presumably we can explain all human behavior in psychological terms, otherwise it has failed. So what you're mistaking there is a difference between an explanation and explaining something away. And this is the difference that I think fundamentally matters, because what matters to people is how they explain things in the sense of not being explained away. What science does is always just simply explain. So, or if it does it well, of course. So good science will be an attempt to explain something accurately, correctly, but it doesn't explain it away. It still just leaves us with the thing that we originally had. And again, we still have to learn how to deal with that. But so much of our energy goes into the one that we tend to forget to focus on the other. There is again, just to throw this in as a kind of a bomb in the middle of the conversation, but the fact that many people refer to us as being in a meaning crisis, it's got to be something that we, not to sound unscientific about it, but you could look at the variables and you can look at the constants. I'm not doing good science here, but you could say, well, the rise of one thing led to the decline in another, and also the sense of a loss of meaning. And I am not suggesting that we replace science with religion. What I'm suggesting is that we can have both. And so the conflict thing, again, is unhelpful, because the one thing is not the other. And very briefly, you mentioned that the conflict model is very much associated with Richard Dawkins. who I think I'll go on record as saying I don't think is a very good philosopher. He gets a pass. He's not a philosopher. So I'll give him a pass on that. But what he does is typically mistake a ritual for a description. So again, good morning. And he says, it's 12:01. No, it's not. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what religion is all about, which is very ritualistic. The value of a ritual, where's that gone in modern life? Well, I can explain it psychologically. You aren't doing it then, are you? You're not going to engage in a ritual if you think you can explain it psychologically. So this is why I think that there's an erosion, perhaps. Maybe it's the erosion model I might want to, because it speaks to a negativity.
Models.
Yeah, maybe. But it probably borrows from lots of the others. So.
No, that's good. Zach, how, in your opinion, how can science and religion inform each other then?
Yeah, so it's got to be done very carefully. There's many naive ways to do this, and many examples of bad ways to do it. And some people have said that everyone does it their own way, and I think that's true. Actually, if you talk to 10 different scientists with religious beliefs, even very similar religious beliefs, the way they integrate their science, their faith can actually be very different, surprisingly different. Even with theologically, they're kind of in the same camp. You might think the same kind of tribe of theologically. But I think a really useful route is through the philosophy of science. So think about the nature of science itself, and I see a theological basis for some of the things that I think are important in the philosophy of science. So things like laws of nature, or things like causation, or things like the intelligibility of nature. These are all kind of metaphysical, philosophical terms that are important in science. And there's good, I think, good strategies for kind of incorporating this within a theological framework. They're actually so good that I think there's actually a challenge to naturalism, or the kind of alternative kind of picture of the world, that nature is all that exists. I think that's a worldview that's kind of lacking the kind of richness of the explanatory framework that theology gets for science. So my route in would be through the philosophy of science usually. But there's so many different sciences that there's one distinction that's worth making. There's not just one kind of uniform science versus uniform faith. Obviously, there's complexity within theology, but there's massive complexity within science, and that the methods and philosophies that people typically assume when they're doing the different sciences are very different. I'm in molecular biology, which is a very empiricist kind of discipline. It's focused on details of how small molecules interact, but I'm also in evolutionary biology, which is a historical science, which actually has quite a different kind of philosophy of science to it. But I think both of these actually have interesting angles that you can bring a kind of theological worldview in. So in the historical science, like the idea that there is history, that there's an arrow to time, there's some kind of linearity to the nature of time that is not cyclical, and maybe there was a beginning and there will be an end. So it's not eternal either. These are things that have that fit very nicely within a kind of broadly Christian or maybe Judeo-Christian kind of framework, in a way that some other worldviews would go against. Many worldviews would see the world as cyclical. So the historical sciences have that angle, and we could talk in various ways about how the other sciences have interacted with theology. But yeah, that's a start.
Well, you raised naturalism there. And you've talked about an explanation not explaining something away. So I want to ask this to both of you, and we'll start with you, Alex, and then I'll get your take back. What can religious knowledge, what is religious knowledge? What can religion tell us that science can't?
Good. So, I mean, science is to some extent a closed system because it's an epistemology. It's a way of gaining knowledge about the world. So if you've used a certain method, you've looked at it a certain way with a certain perspective. What you can never get from that is any kind of third perspective, any point of view. The better way of putting this is the way that Alvin Plantinga has put it, to say if you are within a naturalistic system, exactly as Zach was saying, if you think that nature is it, how do you explain within a purely chaotic natural system that correct beliefs have come about, that you could know anything about reality? I can explain everything we're experiencing right now without any reference to this reality, but to say we are actually flatworms lying in a puddle thinking we're having a conversation about science, religion, and reality, because that's how we release a particular enzyme that keeps us alive. Right? That is exactly to give an account of this reality as much as any other. Alvin Plantinga says, why would you scoff at that and laugh at that? As we all do, right? We all laugh it off. Why are we laughing it off? Because there has to be something outside of that system to say, no, that can't be true. Right? And this goes back to Descartes. Another good point, by the way, around the relationship between, in this case, philosophy and science, but also theology and sciences. Many times you'll have pairs of people. One will be listed a natural philosopher and one will be listed a scientist. The best example, I think, one example is Descartes and Galileo. Another excellent example is Leibniz and Newton. So much so that they were working in the same field that they got accused of plagiarizing the other. So they couldn't possibly be separated in terms of what they were talking about, at least in that instance. So there is clear overlap between these things, but what philosophy or religion or a kind of non-scientific approach is giving you is a way to undergird everything, a way to vouchsafe. You need some sort of guarantor out of just, okay, so let's start a universe. I throw everything up in the air and somehow everything lands on the ground and spells out the words, oh, hello, my name is God. Welcome to this universe. Right? What are the chances of it all just landing in that way? There's a lovely Mitchell and Webb sketch, actually, where they cut open a watermelon and inside the pips spelled out words and it says, there is no God. And atheists see this as a sign. Hooray, it's a sign that's a joke, right, that they're making at the expense of people who believe in miracles. Ironically, though, it's also making a joke at the expense of people who think there is nothing beyond this that can possibly explain it. Because how would we explain the comprehensibility of the universe? As Einstein said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. How can we explain that without something outside it giving it a guarantee? You need some sort of fulcrum, something to give you that latch of truth. And lots of people have looked for it in existentialism or in logic, and this doesn't succeed in that endeavor. Those things don't provide that.
I think maybe another way to say something similar is it's a kind of an epistemological puzzle or puzzle about knowledge to find someone who's a convinced naturalist, to be convinced that the world, that nature is all that exists, because kind of like the Mitchell and Webb sketch, like how would you know that? Like how would you be able to, because you're stuck within the system, how would you be confident that the system is the limits of reality? Particularly, so that's just true just kind of because you're within the system, but particularly if you're an evolved product of that system where the processes that led to your current beliefs weren't interested in you having beliefs about the reality of the whole system. They were only at most interested in you having beliefs about surviving or reproducing or survive from one generation to the next. So there's like puzzles in thinking that you have access to the whole system unless you have a worldview that says there is some access to the totality of reality, which is a kind of broadly religious worldview.
I had a student once argue that in our dreams, we're entering a quantum state, and that quantum physics is through a homeostatic process, which is a term borrowed from biology to refer to the idea that it's the balancing of things, right? This homeostatic process is enabling us to be sane. And I asked him a question well into his research, which was, okay, but why does the universe want us to be sane? And at no point did that student grapple with that question. And again, that's a perfectly plausible and reasonable thing to inquire after. And lots of great people have inquired after this sort of question. I'm not rubbishing the approach. I'm rubbishing the fact that there is a kind of blind willingness, right? So all these people are saying, ha, 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 look at you people with your faith. So the people who are willing to challenge faith in God seem to have faith in sometimes free will, which I find to be in philosophy a perfectly parallel example of this. But another better example, as Zach has already mentioned, is causation. We have no reason to believe that causation exists. Wittgenstein famously said causation is a superstition, because we haven't seen it. There's no evidence for causation. The best argument I've ever heard for belief in causation is, imagine you're sitting on a stool and you look down and you can see two stool legs in front of you. You have to believe that there is a third stool leg behind you, otherwise you'd fall over. That third leg is induction or causation. It's a belief that causal processes unfold. But you can never see that leg. You can never look at it directly. So again, it's like a faith. It's a leap of faith, or it's a sitting of faith in this case. That I find is such a powerful idea that, again, it just goes by the wayside in these kinds of discussions, especially when it's turned into a conflict.
Okay, so we've got that they're separate things, but they talk to each other, they interrelate, and there are things about religion that undergird or sit outside science that can inform it but also ground it. But I know a lot of my atheist friends will say science is a superior epistemology. It's a superior form of knowledge. It's testable. It's repeatable. How do you get religious knowledge? Because religious knowledge sounds a lot like imagination, myth, wish fulfillment. So I'll come to you on this, Zach. What is religious knowledge, and how is it as good as scientific knowledge? Or is it just simply not as good as, it's just a different kind?
Yeah, so this is a hard question. I'm not an epistemologist. I'm kind of scratching the bottom of the barrel here. But I think that like the burden of proof is not really on the person who claims to have religious knowledge. Once we start to unpack like what scientific knowledge is, so I think there's kind of an easy story where science, it's great, it's all very self-explanatory, it's great, it works, and then there's something else, this weird thing, religion. But once you start to unpack science, you realize, oh, there's laws of nature, these metaphysical things, there's causation. And then maybe there's other hints within science that maybe will get you like fine-tuning. Like maybe this world is a special place. It's not just like another pointer away from naturalism. And then consciousness, like the way through which our beliefs about the world are mediated is through this consciousness and our experiences, which don't seem to be quite within the realm of science. So then the whole thing is like problematized from within the science angle. Then the religious knowledge doesn't necessarily become like a fully distinct category. So my approach on this is to kind of break down the distinction between science and religion. I see more of a kind of like a spectrum, and I see things within science potentially pointing kind of outside the naturalistic framework to a theistic framework. Different ways for religious knowledge, I guess there's divine speech. So maybe it's possible that God has communicated in some way. I think the kind of historic Christian view is that there is a book of nature, that God has created the world, and that world in some way communicates something about God. It doesn't communicate that much, but it communicates something. And that's kind of the historic, I would say, orthodox position within
Francis Bacon.
Right. And it goes a long way back. I think the two books idea goes back at least to Augustine and kind of through the medieval period. So this was important in the founding of modern science, but it has very deep kind of theological roots. So that's one way that God can speak, like not as literal speech, but in terms of creation. But then maybe there's also literal speech. So there's maybe the scripture, so the Bible for Christians. And then, of course, the kind of central point of divine communication for a Christian would be the incarnation, that God actually reveals himself in a personal way. So those are three ways by which God might communicate. And then I think the challenge is not so much on the religious believer to justify that, but the skeptic, at least the challenge is at least as much for the skeptic to say, why is that not at least potentially a legitimate form of communication that God could have with us?
There's a couple of things in there that I would like to throw you away, but I do want to pose you the same question first. Is science a superior form of knowledge because of its repeatability, testability, verification, falsification?
So it's definitely not. Simply because let's imagine that someone becomes a cosmologist and studies quasars, and in the procedure of the development of their methodology, they produce a long list of radio frequencies. Is that list the goal? Is that data, the facts alone, was that the goal? Presumably this was to reflect wonder that the universe exists, and so what I'm suggesting is that it's not unique to religious people that they seek to find meaning fundamentally, i.e. the very basis on which to start to inquire or think about the world. But the religious stuff comes first, so it has its principle, but that doesn't mean it's superior. One way I think even an atheist can capture this, can reflect this. Isaac Asimov once said, if you want an absolute, go to a priest. If you want something useful, go to a scientist. Right? And again, science is incredibly useful. If you want medicine, you do a scientific trial. That's how you're going to identify a medicine. Whereas absolutes, we don't have as much of a clear picture of what that kind of knowledge is, because we put everything in scientific terms. This is the kind of drive towards scientism today, that we struggle to see things in any other term. So absolute knowledge is there was a debate between a 15-year-old boy and Richard Dawkins. I don't think the boy had actually volunteered for this debate, but unfortunately that's what he was presented with, where Dawkins suggested that the reason he believed in the Quran was simply because he heard it first. And that's absolutely not what the boy said. What the boy said is, when I read the Quran, I get the right information. And what he meant by that was, it's absolutely true. I must think this way. I must do this. Absolutely. For instance, like I said, the problem then to turn it into relativism is that you then have to start justifying and explaining and giving reasons for this. And this is where always religion gets into difficulty, because it's basically trying to do the same job as science of offering credibility for its beliefs and so on, in the same terms that science offers credibility for its beliefs. So what you'll have is, why did Abraham decide to sacrifice Isaac? Oh, well, there's this whole thing, all these explanations. Whoa, that's monstrous. I'm immediately turned off by religion. This sounds like an awful cult that I never want to be a part of. If you just simply said, because God commanded him to, I'm satisfied, right? The idea that what Kierkegaard calls the teleological suspension of the ethical, which is a very flowery speak for just simply saying there is a command that supersedes morality. And again, this is the interesting thing about religion, is that one of the oldest questions is, does God do something because it's good, or is it good because God does it? And the sort of relativistic person will always go towards, oh, well, he does it because it's good, in which case God is like gravity. Yeah. He's just a force that enacts goodness. But the harder thing, the religious thing, the thing that would actually require struggle, which for me typifies religious belief, struggle, would be to say, no, it's good because God does it, or commands it. So it is good that Abraham should sacrifice Isaac. So again, what I would say is that the knowledge that Abraham gets from this, and again, let's bring in Plantinga again, because he's really interesting on this. And again, one thing you can do is you can secularize it, because he's a very good philosopher, so he knows what he's doing. So he secularizes it and says, imagine you're in court accused of a crime. Loads of evidence comes out against you, genetic, fingerprint, the CCTV evidence. Both of your parents stand as witnesses for the prosecution. You've done it before and been found guilty, and you admit you have done it before. You've written a letter threatening to do it again. Your fingerprints were all of it, and so on and so on. Anyway, so all the evidence gathers up. Any jury in the land can and should find you guilty. And indeed, you even think that the jury should probably find you guilty. However, you happen to know you were skiing that day. By the way, the one flaw of Plantinga is that he often uses very middle class reasons for thinking. Anyway. So you were in Aspen skiing, I think was the example that he's used before. But so that was the case. How do you don't have any evidence to back it up, but you know it because you were there. And my students will always say, oh yeah, that's really interesting, because you might at some point think, I'm going mad. I must be mad. I surely did do this thing, all the evidence. But it'll be way after the jury's decided that you're guilty, and quite rightly so. So your subjective experience gains this kind of ascendancy over the objective facts. How does it do this? And then the minute I throw it back to the students and say, so presumably you'd be okay with someone who said, I had a religious experience, that's why I believe. And they all go, no. Sign of the times, right? That we can't buy into that kind of notion, even though we already have bought into that notion. So again, all I ask for consistency. I think the court case example makes perfect sense to me. So I can't see any reason why his Calvinist views that, our personal experience of God shouldn't give us justification, can't be used as a personal justification. It just can't be used to convince anyone else.
I'm going to be selfish and pick out the thing that I want to critique and challenge in that. I'll put it to our fellow scientists here first. I do get criticized by Christians for having scientific data trump the Bible on certain things for me, as in it's the case of, the Bible seems to suggest this, and it's non-creationists who are criticizing me here. And I say, yeah, but the data wins. Sherlock Holmes, my hero, data, Watson, I can't make bricks without clay. The problem for me with Scopes here is, all the Christians, devout, passionate, prayerful Christians outside the quorum, waving their crosses, calling for the banning of evolution being taught in schools, are wrong on the basis of the data. And it's great that I have to be talking to an evolutionary biologist right here on this. It is therefore scientific data going to trump religious data, for lack of a better way of putting it. I'll put another way of putting it. Einstein says space is curved, general relativity, therefore starlight should be deflected by this much, and I can test it and measure it if you take a photo of an eclipse. Someone else comes and says space is curved because it was revealed to me in a dream. I know which one I'm going with. But am I wrong for their saying like, well, scientific data, yet it's not a superior epistemology? No, it trumps this other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I find it helpful to see them within the same framework. So if nature is the book of God's works, and the Bible is the book of God's word, like if that is the kind of underlying truth, then there's going to be a way to kind of fit these together. Actually, it turns out to usually be quite easy because they very rarely talk about the same thing. Usually they're talking about different things. So at least Galileo is probably apocryphal, said something like the Bible tells you how to go to heaven and science tells you how the heavens go. There's many quotes like this, like geology is about rocks and Bible's about the rock of ages, or many of these quotes. So usually they're talking about different things, but occasionally there are points of contact, and then that's where it could potentially get tricky. And this is a way that you can falsify some claims about the world. I think that if you have a religion based on the idea that something happened in history and that thing did not happen, and there's good evidence against it happening, then you've got to revise your religion or reject the religion. I think that's I think that's true. But it's not that science is certain and religion is like uncertain. So there may be points of tension where the science seems to be saying this, but that's tentative, and religion seems to be saying this, but that's also tentative. There's always interpretation on both sides. But I think the reason that there can potentially be real clashes is that I think evidence builds up. It's not a matter of one thing proving or disproving, which is the way a lot of people think, that like one experiment proves your theory or one piece of data proves your worldview. It's more the way I see it, the way the data kind of builds up. And if it's building up in a way that's consistent with a view, that's good for that view. And if it's building up in a way that's not consistent with that view, then at some point you've got to give up that view. And I think this is how science works, that if your research program is not fruitful, eventually you switch to a different research program. And I think the same is true with worldviews, that some worldviews just end up not really being able to fit with other things we seem to be thinking about the world. And there is potentially a clash there. Just in my experience, I haven't really seen that with Christian faith. I think there is this deep kind of consonance or complementarity between a Christian view of the world and a scientific view of the world.
So we've got a big canvas here, and we're trying to paint what the picture of ultimate reality is. And science is giving us one paintbrush, religion is giving us another one. There are places where I should use this brush and not that one. But overall, I'm building a big picture. Alex, you're not a practicing believer. Is there scientific evidence that could maybe persuade you or move you in your religious position? Or is that not the sort of thing that could do that?
No, it couldn't do that. If I'd cut open my watermelon and it said, Alex, you should believe, I wouldn't be swayed by that. Why? Because all it will have proven is that religion is trivial. And by trivial, I mean like facts are trivial. So who won the 1966 World Cup is a piece of trivia. The fact that I have a heart is trivia, right? But it's very important to me that I have a heart, but it is a piece of trivia nonetheless. Bringing God into the world is not a good way to find religious meaning, as Wittgenstein put it. You can only find meaning in space and time by looking beyond space and time. Words to that effect. So the idea is that, as Kierkegaard put it, God does not exist; he is eternal. The appeal to making God exist, or to giving God some immanent control over the world, would only make him less interesting to me. It's like the naturalist, by the way, has a problem, because imagine if an angel was to walk past the naturalist. All they'll do is they go, "Oh look, another thing to add to my taxonomy, another natural being that exists." So they can't ever not be natural. So they deny the existence of something that can't exist. So naturalism is a completely untenable position anyway. So what are we denying when we deny God? Well, I don't see God in the world. That's what we mean. And by seeing God in the world, no, it doesn't mean that I'm looking for an extra piece of furniture around here. If I feel the eye of God on me, it's a stupid thing to ask what color is it or how many eyelashes does he have. Gagarin was joking when he came back from space and he said, no, he wasn't up there. Although I believe that he told the Communist Party leader that he was. Just to mess with everyone. So the idea being that what I find powerful about religion is precisely what it already is. I don't need to turn it into something that it is not.
Well, that's interesting theologically, because a Christian would say God has come into the world, but that'd be a theological rather than a scientific proposition.
So so even for Simon Weil, who sees a very sharp cut between God, who renounced the world essentially to allow it to come to be, and if he were to enter it, he were to unmake it. What she talks about is of bonds of separation. She uses a beautiful analogy of two prisoners in neighboring cells. The wall is what separates them, but they can communicate by tapping. And she says it's like that between us and God. So the gulf between me and God is far more likely to give me a reason to strain to believe. Same reason that, for instance, apologetics does nothing for me, because apologizing for the evils of the world reminds me that there are evils, and look, they came about because God made them come about. None of this is helping. Non-apologetics, on the other hand, where it says, no, you can love God not despite suffering, but because you suffer, that just grabs me. So maybe I'm a contrarian, maybe I prefer that there are terms within philosophy for apophatic and cataphatic faith based on gaining knowledge. So I need to know more things to build up my knowledge base. I need to understand in order to believe. And apophatic faith, which is I dismiss everything that I know because I know it not to be God, and I'm left with a kind of void or a bond of separation that enables me to come to know God. And it's that apophatic faith that appeals to me.
That's great. Zach, I'm sure you disagree that there is scientific evidence that could point us towards God or make belief in God more reasonable, perhaps.
Yeah.
Why do you take that position and explain this?
So, I think this idea that you can't find God in space and time, you've got to find God outside space and time. I think that's maybe an interesting kind of jumping off point. That it's at least conceivable that there could be things within space and time that point outside space and time. So maybe the clearest point is the beginning of the universe. So this is highly contentious among cosmologists, but if it turns out that the Big Bang is in some sense an absolute beginning, or that there really was a singularity and that there really was nothing that came from, that there was no cause, and it's difficult to talk about this because you can't talk about something before the beginning of time, but there's still, I think there's still metaphysically, there's still a way to talk about whether the world is dependent on something else or not. And if there's nothing physical or natural that the world is dependent on, then that's really surprising and seems to point outside itself. Either we have this bizarre situation of a completely uncaused world, which nevertheless looks highly contingent and it looks like it could have been completely different, and that's completely bizarre, or there is something that's non-natural or non-physical that the world depends on. So that's one example of something that in some senses is within space and time, because the evidence for what looks like a beginning is coming from within, but it's also pointing outside itself.
So I think this is maybe a place where I sit between the two of you, not just literally, but I don't think there's any science in the Bible, for example, at all. There's nothing in the Bible that I look at and say, well, that's science right there, that's scientific. I'm also generally against the idea that you should ever hitch your wagon to the idea that science can provide evidence for believing God, because of the progression of science and how it changes. And also, there's going to be different interpretations. There's going to be, it will grow and develop. It's not generally a good idea. But you've got a few examples you can draw on, and you do think that scientific evidence can ground or enhance or strengthen the claims of religious belief.
Yeah, so usually it's kind of on the fine line between science and philosophy of science. So like the Big Bang is at the beginning of the universe. Quickly you're getting into philosophy of time, philosophy of physics. So I wouldn't kind of push hard that this is like scientific evidence. In fact, I'd push against that. So most of these arguments are, well, they're all philosophical arguments, but sometimes some of their premises are empirical, and that's where science can come in. So as I mentioned, the beginning of the universe, that's a clear one. It's clear in that people have taken it that way. It's also been massively contentious, both within theology and science. Now, there's the fine-tuning of the universe, the idea that the universe is particularly, that the universe is well set up for life, which is kind of a truism, but that as far as we can tell, just slightly adjusting some of the basic parameters of physics would give such a different universe that life as we know it or anything like it couldn't exist, that the atoms wouldn't be interacting with each other. You wouldn't have chemistry, let alone life. I think a good summary for this comes from Richard Swinburne, who I know Alex is not a fan of, but Richard Swinburne says something like, some things in the world are either too big or too strange for science. I think this is the category of stuff.
Including Richard Swinburne, by the way.
Well, I'm a big fan of Richard Swinburne, so Richard, thank you for your work. So some things in the world are too big or too strange for science, and this is the way he frames it, as this is the kind of stuff he appeals to in his arguments. I think that's the right way to go, as opposed to trying to find like a gap within science or trying to find. So at least I think we probably agreed to some extent on that there's stuff you shouldn't try and make any kind of argument for God from, like basically creationist arguments, that there's some gap in a natural process and God needs to fill that. I think we're both skeptical of that kind of move. But there's other things that are outside of science. And for me, as a scientist, the interesting things are those that are kind of on the borderline between science and philosophy. So like the beginning of the universe, like the fine-tuning of the universe. For me, my work is in evolution. I'm very interested in, is there some directionality in evolution? That by itself, it doesn't necessarily have religious entailments or even necessarily implications, but it goes against what's kind of the default worldview to such a strong extent that I think it really is, it undercuts the worldview that a lot of scientists would have. So there's stuff that's kind of on the borders between science and philosophy that's just outside of what science itself looks like it is going to be able to explain. Consciousness might be another one. So if there's like good in principle reason to think that this is not the kind of thing that a normal naturalistic explanation will account for, but theism actually gave you some kind of independent reason to expect or to think it fits well, then that's evidence, very simply, for theism over naturalism. This might not be so interesting in the context of the discussion with Alex, because Alex is not a naturalist, but most of my colleagues are naturalists. And most of the...
Can any of them define it, though?
No, well, that's a different... They're not philosophers. But my colleagues in the broader sense of the scientific community, the worldview is naturalism. And so in that conversation, in that dialectic, I think making the move from something that's kind of within science as a pointer to outside science, that's actually good. And the fact it's... like you raised the point that, well, science changes, which is also a common response to this. But one reason that in that dialectic this doesn't matter is that naturalism also always changes, because naturalism is usually defined in relation to science. So if naturalism is always trying to catch up with whatever science is doing, then it's also fine for the arguments against naturalism to be such that they are kind of conditional on the current science. So there's kind of, it makes sense in response to naturalism to point to things within the naturalistic worldview that kind of sit within the naturalistic framework, but point outside that framework.
I'm with you, but I want to push back on something, and I'll propose this to you, Alex. Aside from the birth of modern science, which you've rightly pointed out is grounded in a lot of Christian framework, like Francis Bacon that we mentioned, and Newton, which you mentioned, and many, many others, William Wall. Naturalism has been tremendously successful within science. This is sort of the argument from success that I get from my non-theistic friends.
It's not falsifiable, though, so it can't be unsuccessful. If you discover it, it's natural. So, of course, everything discovered turns out to be natural. It's a fait accompli.
In terms of a methodology practiced within science, that when I'm doing science, I'm only looking for the natural. I'm trying to understand the natural processes. So I'm not going to invoke angels and things like that. As in, when I'm doing science, I'm not looking for miracles. I'm not studying miracles, and I'm just trying to understand the mechanistic processes. That has been so tremendously successful, not just within science, but for the production of technology and advancing humanity. So what's wrong with the argument from success? in terms of a philosophical framework.
So I'm just going to go back to a couple of points that Zach made. So firstly, the too big and too strange, they're also too small and too mundane. I'm sorry, it goes into a give and take, pointless kind of tit for tat kind of arguing that just doesn't take us anywhere. If something is too small and too mundane for God to have created it, does that mean that God can't possibly exist? It's highly selective. Firstly, to say, oh, you can't look for gaps in evolution to then, fill the void with God. Where did creationism come from, if not from religion? You can't say, I'm going to ignore all the things that have been proven false by religion and only focus on those things that are at the cusp of brand new science, which hasn't yet been proven or established, that doesn't yet go against. It's a very selective set of criteria for determining whether these two things support each other. And like I said, the ultimate goal here, let's not lose sight of the final goal, like success, right? Success here would prove failure. One of my students tried to argue with me that chi is an energy. And I asked her, do you mean by energy the same thing I mean by energy, potential energy, kinetic energy, electrical energy, all these kinds of different kinds of energies? And she said, yes, that's exactly what I mean. And I said, well, firstly, all those energies are measurable and have been discovered. Why have we not measured chi? You've claimed to have discovered it without any measurement. Well, they tend to go hand in hand, those two things. So you're claiming a scientific discovery without any science. And secondly, and much more importantly, where's the religion gone? Why is this significant? Why is the discovery that chi might be like magnetism? Do people worship magnetism? Do people bow down to magnesium? I don't understand why people would find a sense of purpose or meaning in a scientific explanation of anything. And then, much worse than this, I actually offered an answer, a solution, which I found deeply meaningful. In fact, the most meaningful source of all things, language. I suggested, well, maybe that's what chi is, right? We have a shared energy. I'm not dismissing her beliefs. I'm suggesting here's a way of accounting for them, which doesn't require you to force yourself to believe anything, doesn't require you to allude to some sort of taxonomic evidence that you can't find. It just means you have to say, yeah, language is public. Which means it isn't just individuals all speaking out to each other. This is Wittgenstein, by the way, just full disclosure, where he says, imagine everyone had a box and you ask, what's in your box? What's in your box? And everyone opens it and says, beetle. How do we know what's in the box? Well, we wouldn't know it's a beetle because one person might have a VW Beetle, one might have John Lennon, one might have a word beetle, one might be from a language where doorknob means beetle and that's what's in there. We don't know. We wouldn't have a clue. Language couldn't get started. The fact that we have language is proof that language is public first, private second. That would explain shared consciousness, the way in which, for instance, just to bring it back to science, evolution can happen at the same time. Calculus can be discovered at the same time because there's public discourse and public understanding. Understanding has been, especially during the Enlightenment, was located here in a genius's brain. Maybe it should have been located here in the spaces where intelligent people have intelligent conversations and make discoveries. That's where genuine advancement takes place. So that's why two people can come up with the same idea at the same time, or someone can have an idea at the wrong time and it doesn't work and then it doesn't fit into the public discourse. So here's an idea of shared consciousness, which I've gifted to her in a perfectly explicable way, and she doesn't want it. Why doesn't she want it? Because there is weight to science. There is a kind of mass and kind of significance given to finding the stuff that explains my stuff. Right, that all my experiences and so on has to be explained by this. And very briefly, going back to the consciousness point as well, because I think this is very important. I can explain why science can't explain consciousness, but I don't have to invoke God. I just have to invoke the fact that science has a methodology that's based on breaking things. It's not a problem with science. It's not its weakness. It's how it does things. It breaks things. What if we break this? What if we introduce a new variable? What if we split it in half? What happens? You can't split consciousness. Henry Bergson, the wonderful philosopher who's not widely talked about enough, gave the analogy of a film reel. If you hit pause, you get a freeze frame. And we tend to think of the universe all in these terms of quantitative moments of freezed time. Instead, though, imagine that the consciousness, that's a brain scan, by the way, but imagine consciousness is the music that was playing. Where's that gone? It's gone completely. Right? So, and Wittgenstein had a nice way of proving this. He said, at what point do you understand this sentence? Because if you're going to say the end, I'll just give it the end. No understanding. The point is understanding took place dynamically across time, and no brain scan will show you the moment at which understanding took place. And this is partly a ill fit of semantics. The brain is not showing understanding. Understanding is a semantic term we use in language. The brain is a stuff. it doesn't even equate with binary. There's no ones and zeros in it. It's just cells that are neither ones nor zeros. They're ambiguous. They're a mundane triviality. Again, I look to the mundane triviality, not the big and strange stuff. That's unhelpful. The mundane trivialities are the stuff where we find, oh, look, this is actually what's indicating meaning, because the gulf between the meaning and the trivial, I am just trivial. I am just made up of this trivial stuff. But somehow out of that, hopefully, I can make meaningful utterances, but that's for other people to decide.
Zach, would you like to respond to either what I said or what Alex said? And pick what like.
There's a lot there, so I'm not going to be able to pick up on the audience is going to be left frustrated that Alex has said things and you've said things that I just haven't responded to, and it's not because there's no responses. It's just that this is just so. I think I think science is effective in its sphere. I think we kind of probably agree on that. And there's some things that science is just not trying to do or is not able to do. So it might like to be able to do it, but it's just not. It finds, okay, that door is closed to it. And then the question is, what do we do with that? Do we just say, okay, that door is closed to science? Or we say, no, science is going to solve it. Even if there is a good in principle reason to think it's not going to be able to. So some people are just hard-nosed materialists. They'll say, no, science is going to be able to do it. Even if there's like an in principle, like definitional thing that's not going to be able to do it. Others will say, okay, it's fine. We've reached the door. That door's closed. That's the end of the story. And another option is, well, maybe it's not the end of the story. Maybe there's another picture within which science fits, which also accounts for what's behind that door. And that's my kind of approach, that the theism. So in thinking about consciousness, it's not that, oh, science can't do it, therefore you need God. It's just that, well, if God is in some sense personal, a mind, mental, the fact we find mentality or persons in the world is not surprising. Fits fine. If reality is at the fundamental level mental, that in the beginning was the word, the logos, which is the rational principle, then it's not surprising that we are rational creatures. Whereas I think it is more surprising that there are rational creatures or experiencing creatures in a world which is at base atoms in chaos, maybe strings or something, subatomic particles, just energy. That why there should be rational creatures in that kind of world is quite a surprise. So that's the kind of picture that I want to do. That which framework has the resources to account for the things we see in the world. Also with things like evolution. It's not that this is just something that science hasn't got its head around yet, but in principle, maybe there's some things that are just fundamental properties of the world that either you leave as a brute fact or you say there is a theistic explanation for it. Those are the kind of things I think are the best candidates for theistic explanation. That's, I think, what Swinburne is saying. And I think the naturalist just has a whole lot of brute facts that the universe is just utterly mysterious and it's very odd, and that's just the way it is. Whereas for the theist, it's not as odd. There's some deeply odd things, particularly evil. That's a deep paradox for theism. But other things like consciousness, that's not a surprise. Fine-tuning of some kind, the idea the universe is set up for life, that's not a surprise. Universe looks like it had a beginning, that's not a surprise. The universe is understandable, that's not a surprise, etc. So the universe follows laws of nature, that's not a surprise. This goes back to something that Sam was saying, that we have like the success of methodological naturalism, that science works. Well, that's just a methodology, and that's not like it by itself a kind of broader ontology or picture of how the world actually is. So the idea that using this method works doesn't really tell us that much, particularly when actually I think a better account of that method is a theistic picture of the world. Like the reason that there are laws of nature that are intelligible to humans makes better sense on theism than it does on naturalism. So I wouldn't call it methodological naturalism. Maybe methodological like deism or methodological theism even, because I think the best account of laws of nature is that there's some relationship to God there, and that's sort of like a whole other discussion. But there's properties of laws of nature that are super odd for naturalism, but made perfect sense within theism. That's why people like Newton and etc. Use the whole metaphor of laws of nature, is because God is the cosmic king who has laws over the universe. So this whole language of laws of the cosmos is actually very theistic. So it would be weirdly ironic to say, oh, if we assume that there's laws of nature, therefore we're going to prove atheism, which is how a lot of people think. But I think it's confused, because the scientific method assumes these things that actually fit better within theism.
Yeah, I've got to ask you in brief. We've already established that you're not a naturalist, but you're not a theist either,
Or an atheist.
Or an atheist. Is there an ist that Dr. Alex Carter can fit under, or are you going to create your own model there as well?
I mean, the one that would be banned would be theist, who is separating science and religion, although that's often misdiagnosed, because no theist I've ever heard labeled with that term would actually make the claim that scientific discoveries haven't influenced religion and vice versa. So it just doesn't hold water for very long. Although the book, Wittgensteinian Theism, ? Between Kai Nielsen and D.Z. Phillips, goes on for a very long time with D.Z. Phillips saying, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. No, I don't say that. No, I don't say it. So it's a weird book. I just want one point I think which we can certainly agree on is that there is something beyond science which is justifying people's belief that one day science will explain everything. Right? That is a superstitious belief. It is not a scientific belief. If you have, I believe, I've got some scientists here, if I have incomplete evidence, the evidence is inconclusive. The answer then would be, one day we don't know if science will explain everything. That's the scientific position that we should all be adopting, no matter how successful science is. So it tells me more about the person saying that than it does about the science for someone to say one day science will explain everything. But having started this conversation by saying psychology is not the way to go to explain that, I'm now going to say psychology is the way to explain that. It is a fact of people's psychology that their attitude is turned in a certain direction. They are attuned by certain things. And by constantly getting success, to answer your previous question, except this one feels like a too-runny sketch, because of all that success, we've attuned ourselves in such a way to expect those same kind of results. So it becomes, there was a classic bet that was placed between Chalmers and the computer scientist who said, I'll make a conscious AI in 10 years. And Chalmers said, no, you won't. And he didn't. But I actually go further than that. Chalmers calls it the hard problem of consciousness. It is the impossible problem of consciousness for the reason I've alluded to. There is no way to make sense of that. Anyway, so my viewpoint on the kind of what's explaining the gulf is perfectly easily explained. It's sitting right here. It's me, it's us, it's people. We are the ones who invent natural laws. What are natural laws except laws that keep changing dependent upon the things that we happen to see? These aren't laws. We didn't set the law and then see the results. We saw the results and modified the law. That's not a law. That's a constantly changing algorithm responsive to the evidence that is presented in front of us. What happens tomorrow when a natural law is violated? We change it. So it's not natural laws in the world. It's natural laws in us. We're doing this.
Okay, well, I guess I can push back against that a bit. And that I am a scientific realist. And I think not hopefully a naive realist, like a critical realist, just to kind of... Not that that's much of an out in this kind of discussion, but that we're at least trying to approximate truth, I think. And this is maybe where I disagree with Alex. That I think science is, I think there are bad theories in the past, but I think there's some connection between those theories and our current theories, and I think our current theories are better. And so I don't think that I fully expect that a bunch of things that we think we know about the laws of nature are going to change, but I do have the faith, probably related to my Christian faith or the kind of heritage I sit within, that there are laws of nature that we don't have the perfect equations for yet, but we're getting closer to what reality is like. I think that's the faith of the scientist. The general faith of scientists is that we live in a world that, for whatever reason, is understandable and that we're going to be able to explain. And that's a remarkable faith that scientists have. And I think it's a faith that fits perfectly nicely within Christian theism, struggles with naturalism, struggles with some other worldviews. So
could it also, though, be explained by the fact that science is fictional the minute it becomes useful? So ironically, Asimov saying that science is useful and, funnily enough, wrote science fiction, the idea that, for instance, you have a graph, you have data points on it, the line of best fit does not have to intersect with any of those data points to be the line of best fit. And we would call that the law. For sake of argument, right, this is what we might call a rule or a law that we're observing. But it never has to intersect with any data point. And it's certainly, if you were to draw it at every data point, you'd have to draw a zigzag line, which wouldn't be of any use because I can't predict on the basis of that. So again, it's human use that tarnishes the accuracy of science. Science can be absolutely accurate about what's gone. It cannot be accurate about what's to come. Just as we can't in this conversation make that claim. But there is truth. No question there's truth. There are 3 mugs on this table. rude people who are going to leave comments will say there's 3 mugs behind this table. But there are 3 mugs on this table is a true statement. The other one is not. But that's a true statement that because it describes the world, but it's describing a world that is empirically perceived. This is the basis of science. If I go beyond that empirical perception and say, I've seen many rooms with 3 cups on the table, will I see more 3 cups on the table going forward? Now we're in fiction territory. Now we're in, and it may be a very accurate fiction, but all good fiction is, including pure fiction, is very good because it accurately reflects the human condition. And again, if the Bible is going to be true to fact or accurate, it's going to be in its true reflection of the human condition. By the way, there were probably many other Bibles, many other people espousing viewpoints in that time period. Plenty of prophets, plenty of people doing that, who didn't get their ideas written down, precisely, or didn't survive the writing because they didn't resonate with people. So again, there is a truth to the Bible, which I hope can be reflected in what people reflect on when they reflect, because it's survived a test of time. Ideas don't survive the test of time if they don't have weight and substance behind them. But what are they reflecting? Is it historical truth? Is it scientific truth? Or is it a human truth? Surely the last one has got to be more interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of dichotomies here that I just don't fully buy into. I think with science, I guess we disagree on science. I think science is often predictive. I think laws of nature are in some sense normative. I think they are actually, that science is remarkably accurate. And when people say science works, it is because of things like we can predict bizarre consequences, bizarre phenomena that we have no reason to predict other than the assumption that these laws are true. And that doesn't prove that the laws are correct, but I think it is some evidence towards them. And so I think there is a reasonable kind of positive kind of induction from the success of science to it's something like truth-likeness. And it's not a naive realism that says, therefore, we've got the final laws of nature, because obviously new experiments are going to come along that are going to shift some things. But the remarkable accuracy of science, I think, can't just be dismissed. I think things like the kind of line of best fit, like why is it that the simple line or the elegant line it is often the one that actually turns out to be the best scientific law. So many theoretical physicists have kind of commented on this idea that I think Paul Dirac said something like God writes the universe in beautiful mathematics. And he was an atheist, but towards the end of his life, I think he was exploring some kind of non-naturalistic things, because maybe at least this idea that the mathematics and the world are kind of integrated, and not only mathematics, but beautiful mathematics. There's an elegance to the world, also a simplicity. That means that our intuitions about which is the best scientific law actually turn out to be predictive in a way which I think we don't have a right to kind of expect. So Einstein said something like that: this is a gift that we neither expect nor deserve.
But the beauty of E equals mc squared, which I have reflected on many times myself, can simply be tarnished by saying E equals mc squared minus E equals mc squared plus E equals mc squared. That's the limits of my mathematics, by the way. But my point is, that's less elegant. Why would we do that? You just cancel it down. So the elegance doesn't come necessarily from the thing itself. But again, that's not a definitive claim. I'm not saying the world is messy, but it's definitely messier than it needs to be. And again, there are lots of mathematical formulas that aren't as simple as that. And for instance, general and special relativity not easily aligning together, and these other ill fits. And again, one thing that Wittgenstein said that was really quite charming at the time he said it, because we've completely abandoned it and given up on the idea, was why assume simplicity and generality rather than multiplicity and difference? I mentioned myself that I'm sitting on a stool, I can see 2 legs in front of me, so I assume there's 1 leg behind me, at least 1 leg behind me. There could be 57 million legs behind me. Science could be a science propped up on 57 million different legs. A beast with a billion backs? I don't know. Anyway, but the idea of that science is this kind of multiplicity rather than this simplicity could actually help to explain things better than the simplicity. It's not to say the simple things aren't there, but it's just to say there are enough of those simples that there could be plenty of multiples.
We could go down quite a few rabbit holes here, but I'm conscious of time, and there's just one last question, and what will have to be brief, that I want to finish on, because it crosses 2 lines we've been uneasy with here. One is that the question of whether or not science can provide evidence or reasonable grounds to believe in God. and the other is Francis Bacon's Book of God's Works. God's given us two books, the Book of His Word, by which he meant the Bible, and the Book of His Works, which, as you correctly said, can go back further. And holding these in tension, I want to know what we could learn about God through looking at nature and creation. And because there's this instinctive awe that we feel when we see a cold winter, cloudless, starry night, and you just go, or when you encounter nature and its brilliance or glory, like you look out a plane window and see the Grand Canyon, or you're swimming in a coral reef and you just see an explosion of color that just takes your breath away. It's a natural human instinct, like a hammer tap on the knee makes your leg reflex. It's the most human thing in the world to encounter nature and its glory and be struck with awe. And that awe is often a pointer towards something greater, something beyond that we've been talking about. But you also mentioned Charles Darwin, who lost his faith really for three fundamental reasons, even though he never became an atheist. One, the death of his daughter. One, his aggravation that God, a good God, could send reasonable seeking people who don't believe to hell. And finally, the Ichneumonidae, the wasp, being confronted in South America by this parasitic wasp that is just so brutal and horrible, cuts open the bodies of caterpillars, lays its eggs in their warm body. The caterpillar doesn't die, the eggs hatch, and then eat the still living caterpillar. He's just like, what kind of God could do this? So we have this awe that points people towards God in this book of God's works. And then we look at some stuff in nature and go, no, how could there be a good God? What kind of God is this? Disease, parasites, viral infection. What do we reckon, gentlemen, to finish? See if we can make that concise. Can nature tell us anything meaningful?
I mean, my very simple answer is just to ask, like, which one seems more fundamental in this? That we have evil, we have suffering, and then we have order and design, or things that bring us to awe, and this harmony in the universe and beauty. And maybe it is really simplistic, but I really think that the goodness of creation is more fundamental than the badness, and that the badness only makes sense in light of a kind of a deeper goodness. And I think there's various ways to flesh that out, but scientifically, I think it is underlying order. That's the basis of science. And there's a lot of messiness in science, but the faith of the scientist is that messiness is going to be able to be interpreted within a framework of deeper order. Otherwise, there's no point in kind of attacking it with the scientific hammer. And so, yeah, that's I think theologically that's the doctrine of creation, that creation is first and foremost good, and then it is twisted in some ways by evil. But the evil, this is different to worldviews where you have good and evil as kind of opposite sides of the same coin, or equal, that there's two powers in heaven that are both fighting each other. The Christian claim is that the goodness is fundamental. And I think that fits with the scientific framework that ultimately there is order and goodness, so that creation is good and worth studying. And evil does remain a mystery, but a mystery that's not going to be there forever in the Christian picture.
So goodness and order and fundamental. Alex, finally, can nature tell us anything about God?
I do find it interesting that someone who is religious will point to the examples of beauty and love and goodness in the world and say, that supports my faith. And interestingly, people who find horrors in the world don't form the belief God exists and I hate him. They form the belief God doesn't exist. It's an odd asymmetry between those two types of claim. And again, or what would explain this would be human wants as opposed to human needs. I think human needs are met by encountering the world exactly as it is, which means encountering all of it, the horrible and the beautiful. I do think it's quite interesting that we're so resistant to the idea of evil in nature. We're so at home with the idea that evil is something that we do or God must do. I try to get students to accept this, not the caterpillar, the wasp and caterpillar example, but the shoebill. The shoebill bird has two chicks. One of them will survive and one of them always will not. That's not the evil bit. The survivor will always bully the one that's going to die. That's not the evil bit either. It's not great, but it's not the evil bit. The evil bit is that when the mother brings back food, both of the chicks beg for food and only one of them ever gets it. So there's this kind of like, oh, if I could make a candidate for something being evil, being outside of human, but you have to look really hard to find it. So that kind of backs up Zach's point that you'd have to go looking for this stuff. And I do think that the book of facts that I think science is generally neutral on value, and that you have to bring value by looking at it. You don't get any value derived directly from the facts. It's a very old, some would say trite philosophical position that we can separate facts from values. And maybe we can. Well, maybe we can't. Maybe it's possible theoretically to separate these two things. If you're going to find value anywhere, though, it has to be in religion, and it has to be values that I find meaningful and sustaining in my life. So I don't think we should go looking in nature for the reasons to subsist or persist. But we can find those in nature. We can find them elsewhere too. And we can find them in religion. In fact, if it's not doing it, then it's not doing its job.
Thank you. Thank you both, gentlemen. As always, it's been a very spirited and enjoyable discussion for me, and I hope to you as well. A special thank you to Kenilworth Youth for Christ for having us today, and St. John's Church, Kenilworth. Much appreciated. And I hope you enjoyed this and tune in for more episodes of Unbelievable as they come to you.